The .NET Core podcast is supported by our listeners who have become patrons. To see a full list of the patrons, or to join them, head over to .NETCore.show/patrons. Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast. A podcast where we reach into the core of the .NET technology stack and, with the help of the .NET community, present you with the information that you need in order to grok the many moving parts of one of the biggest cross-platform multi-application frameworks on the planet. I am your host, Jamie Gaprogman-Taylor, and in this episode I talked with Daniel Verber about Gremlinq, a link provider for graph databases which support Gremlin script. David also gives a description of graph databases and when you might use them. We also talk about how trying out newer technologies is getting easier and easier due to the proliferation and the drop in price of cloud storage. We also had a short chat about the many different ways to support open source technologies, with contributions, really well-researched bug reports, and with direct donations or purchasing licenses. It is a topic which is for much smarter people than me and was prompted by a discussion around Duende and Identity Server 5. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. Hello, Daniel. Thank you very much for being on the show. It's a pleasure to talk to you today, and I'm interested to find out about Gremlinq and how it all fits together and how I can use it in applications. But welcome to the show.
Thanks. Thank you. Hi, Jamie. Thanks for having me. Great to be here. Thank you very much. Yeah, my name's Daniel. I'm from Germany. I'm a software engineer, mainly .NET from the very beginning in 2002. I've seen it all. Version 1, 1.1, 2, generics coming up, and all that compact framework. And I've been doing it ever since. I haven't really done anything besides that from a language perspective. To be honest, for I think it's 4 years now, I've been developing this .NET Object Graph Mapper, which is called Gremlinq.
Excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to talking about that in a moment. But one of the things that I've just kind of made this connection in that the majority of the folks who've been on the show so far have been in .NET since relatively the beginning. And I think that's a good thing. I think that shows that there's a maturity to the language support and the actual API space. And I think that's pretty good because, I mean, if everyone who was coming on the show were like, yeah, I've been doing .NET for 5 minutes and, I'm going to talk about this one thing that I've done, and that would also be fine. But I think just the fact that it's been around for, 21, 22 years now, 21 years, I guess.
Yeah, I think the first previews could be dated back to 2001, I guess. So it's 20 years. Maybe there's a celebration coming up at some point. I don't know.
Yeah, well, maybe. I mean, we'll have to. Obviously, I have no affiliation with Microsoft at all, but maybe there's something coming up at MS Build or Ignite or something. Hey, 20 years, woohoo! Or maybe they'll just go, whatever.
It would be cool to have some kind of retrospective on that by Microsoft. I don't know.
Yeah.
If they want to be associated to the old stuff anymore, I don't know.
I think I do know that Richard Campbell of .NET Rocks is working on a series of books chronicling the history of it all. And I believe he goes back to the early 90s with it because .NET has that much of a lineage, right? So maybe that'll get. I don't know. I know that I've chatted with him before about it, both on the podcast and in person at conferences, and he says, "Yeah, it's coming. It's going to take a long time."
That would be super awesome. I would definitely buy that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I first heard about it, it was going to be a single book, and now it's going to be in volumes.
Yeah, there's going to be one book for version 1.0, 1.1,
Absolutely.
and so on.
Yeah, apparently he's making it out of interviews with other with the people who are behind the whole thing. So presumably the three Scots, presumably Anders Heiselberg, people like that, everyone who's involved. But anyway, I've digressed way too much, right? Okay, so I'm interested to find out about Gremlinq. I genuinely know almost nothing about it, so I haven't used it yet. But I know that it's used. So let me get this right. So there's a thing called Tinkerpop, I believe, which is used by the cloud providers who provide their sort of GraphQL thing. Is that correct? Am I getting that right? I'm not sure.
It kind of is. So what Tinkerpop is if I got that right, because I'm not too much in the Apache or Tinkerpop communities. I'm just a kind of a user as well. So forgive me if I don't have the actual accurate corporate address on that one. So, but let me try to explain. So, as far as I got it, Tinkerpop is a graph computing framework. So, given a graph which is somewhere represented on whatever storage or in memory or whatever, Tinkerpop is what can leverage this graph. And the graph, I should say, is a set of vertices connected by edges with properties on the vertices and properties on the edges. And what Tinkerpop does, and the Tinkerpop code is, it computes on the graph. This is why it's called a graph computing framework. So given a graph and given some things you would like to know about this graph, this is your query, right? It can leverage this graph and do all kinds of stuff with it and come up with an answer about the graph. So this is what Tinkerpop does. It's, to the best of my knowledge, not so much concerned with the storage, because the storage is pluggable. You can, at least in theoretically, plug pretty much any kind of storage there. You can plug an SQL database in there, any kind of NoSQL databases. And what Tinkerpop provides, the Apache Tinkerpop project, is a graph query language, because it wouldn't be nothing without a matching language to query the graph. So once you got your graph and you want to know something about it, you need a formalism to express your intent, what you want to know about the graph, what you want to query. And this is called Gremlin. It's a graph traversal language. It's a procedural language in contrast to other languages, most notably Cypher. And the difference is, in the declarative approach, you would kind of describe your result set. And on the other hand, what Gremlin does is you will describe how to get there. Gremlin allows you to take a look at your graph, take a look at all the vertices, and describe where to start, on which vertices to start, where to go, and where to filter out edges and vertices. And what remains in the end is your result set. So I like this approach better. I think it's more powerful, though this might be up to any language theorists to determine whether. Probably they are equally powerful, because in computer science, as soon as you kind of Turing complete, everything is equally powerful, right? But I like the approach that Gremlin takes much better. And this is Tinkerpop and Gremlin in a nutshell.
Okay. I do find that when I'm discussing different languages and frameworks and different ways of doing things, I always say, well, this particular thing, this technique, this language, whatever, is great at this problem, but there will be problems that it's not so good at. Like, you could. One of the things that I did at university was we studied AI, but we used the language Prolog, which sounds like it's a little bit declarative. You declare a data set, and then you say, you might say, you might declare a family tree, and you'll say if John and Joan have a child called Jim, and you say, who is Jim's mother if Jim's father is, I'm getting really confusing with my example there, but that's more traversal of data and figuring out data. You can write a calculator in Prolog, but it won't be as efficient as something in almost any other language, right? And so there are problem sets, I think, that work really well with that must work really well with graph data. I'm struggling to find my words this evening. There must be problems that work really well with graph data sets and graph languages and that kind of those kinds of techniques that obviously other I don't want to say SQL, but other kind of languages and techniques and data storage methodologies probably don't work so well in. So I think, having not used any graph stuff myself other than talking to Cosmos DB, I would say that I think perhaps GraphQL, graph languages, Tinkerbot will obviously have a very specific set of problems that it solves really well. And the way I see it as well is if one language or framework sort of mirrors the way that you approach problems, then totally use that. Don't try and shoehorn your own process, your own problem solving process into another language or framework, because you'll end up fighting with it and producing something that is a halfway house between how you solve the problem and how the language solves the problem. And so, if GraphQL and graph data storage works better, then do that. That's what I say.
I think it really comes down to your domain, whatever domain you want to model, and whether it lends itself more to a graph structure or more to a, I don't know, some problems are definitely, there's problems that are completely sufficiently described in a key value store, right? For other things, you might need documents because you have an unbounded complexity of things to store. And there's query languages for that. So it really comes down to your domain. You should take a good look at it and figure out whether it lends itself to that. And not only that, but also the queries, the things you want to know about your data. It's not, you can't just throw Gremlin at it and it'll solve all your problems. Just right. I agree. The right job, the right tool for the right job, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where getting experience with, at least knowing that these other technologies exist, right? You don't have to get your hands dirty, get elbow deep in the actual, how does it all fit together? But knowing that these other ways of dealing with data exist are kind of, I'd see that they're very important, because there's that phrase, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And if you're only ever doing key value stores, then you're just going to do key value stores and you're going to shoehorn something in that does, like you say, doesn't fit the domain. Or, you said there about maybe using documents because you've got an unbounded context and all kinds of stuff. So maybe documents is better for, whatever you're working on, or maybe just normalizing all your data and shoving it into SQL tables works better. Whatever it is that fits that domain, and then, but like you said there, whatever fits that domain. But then you need to have the knowledge that these other tools and techniques exist, don't you? Because I remember early in my career, everything is SQL. Everything is normalized data. It's got to be. And then you have a primary key and a foreign key, and a lookup table and a join table and another table to join these things, and you end up with an object graph that is 5,000 different tables. And whereas if you wanted to, you could store it all as one document in a document database, right?
Yeah, well, everything had to be SQL because there weren't really any alternatives, were they?
Mm-hmm.
Were there? I don't know. Maybe some obscure, but I'm not. I don't know how long NoSQL approaches have been around now. I think it's probably already 20 years. 20 years at least. yeah, they kind of offered a completely whole new view on these things, and it's good to have them around. Um, but there's caveats. SQL isn't too bad to begin with because it's got all these ACID properties, right? And you got to give them up mostly in any NoSQL approach. So this might or might not fit your domain or your requirements on your software eventually. But yeah, that's definitely a thing um, to be aware of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like you say, there's pros and cons to everything, right? If you do need to make sure that that you have transactions and that those transactions are ACID and that they will always happen in the order that you send them, then okay, SQL is probably the way to go. But if you are just loading lumps of data, maybe a big blob of JSON, you just want to store it in somewhere, then maybe a document or maybe a graph might be better. I don't know. I'm not a database expert. So, I just look at what's available and try to figure out what fits, like you said, what fits the domain.
We figured that graph is the way to go when we started developing a whole new project. And we started out using SQL. We started out using SQL Server. Then we kind of migrated to MariaDB. I think it was what's MariaDB is a fork of.
Is it MySQL? Is that right?
Right. So we used that first, then went to MariaDB. We used Entity Framework to do the mapping. Then we used an Hibernate to do the mapping because we Entity Framework kind of fell short. We couldn't use Entity Framework for the classic Entity Framework, which I don't know had version 5 or 6 back then. Then we tried Entity Framework Core, which was really in its infancy right back then. That wouldn't support any inheritance, so we kind of went back and forth, and nothing would really fit our requirements because we are very heavy in structure. Our domain is very structurally heavy. Lots of relationships to between all kinds of domain entities. Sometimes you don't even know the type of the entities. You might have an entity and go a certain relationship, and you don't even know what's there, or you might be unbounded in your relationship. Like we have this ownership concept in our domain, where something can be owned, an entity can be owned by another entity, and this entity in turn can be owned by another entity. So let's say you want to get the eventual owner, like the top owner of these things, the owner to settle it all, right? You are pretty much, we got stuck a lot using just SQL and Hibernate or Entity Framework. Because we had these recursive, potentially unbounded relationships, we couldn't really model the entities in a way that would allow us to have an entity being owned by, let's say, a user and a company as well, like a phone. Phone can be owned by a user and a company. So how are you going to model that in SQL or in eventually in Hibernate or Entity Framework? You got to use inheritance, but this got some caveats as well. So we got really stuck. And then we discovered graph databases. And of course, the fallacy here is, as you pointed out a couple of minutes ago, if you only got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And this is also kind of what happened to us. We figured, all right, cool. This is the solution to all of our problems, right? This is we're going to use graph databases, and everything's going to be fine. No clouds in the sky. Everything's going to be awesome, which it mostly is. But then there's the asset properties that are not really there for, let's say, Cosmos DB. There's other databases like Neptune that does support ACID. So it's kind of kind of the same back and forth. Let's see what they can do. Let's see what they can do. Let's try this approach against this approach. It's like the same we had back then. Only this time it's on graph databases. So but it's one thing is still true. Graphs are the appropriate model for our data. And I don't know, I would encourage everybody to at least take a look when modeling a greenfield project. Could this be a graph? In fact, I would argue that tables in a SQL database form them by themselves a graph as well, right? You could view a table as an entity. Whenever you got a foreign key somewhere, that's an edge, right? So every row in your table is a vertex, and any foreign key is an edge to another table, to another. So this is kind of already a graph, but you might not need graph technologies, graph databases in the end. It all depends. So, but I would encourage anybody who's free to in their choice of technologies to have a look.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, I often say to folks, just build something, build a hobby project. You don't have to be super complex. You don't necessarily have to do it with tests in mind and great architecture in mind. Just get a project. Build it in, if you're trying to learn, say, let's take graphing databases, right? If I want to build something where I get an idea of how I'm going to use a graph database, well, I can sit here and I can read a book and I can think about the theory of how it works. Or I can get my hands dirty, do .NET New, create something that talks to a graph database and go, oh, that's how it works. That's how all of these entities hang together. This is how this specific domain works, Totally. That I feel like we have almost no excuse, right? We've got all of these tutorials online. We've got the documentation for all of the libraries. I'm sure there's lots of really good documentation with Gremlinq, which we'll come on to in a minute. And there's all sorts that you can just you can go to see go view a talk. You can watch it on YouTube, Pluralsight, whatever. There are other training providers, of course, and it's almost like I said, you have no excuse now, right? Because you just go, oh, GraphQL in .NET, boom, there you go. Right, okay, I've got 5 million results, brilliant, and that will get me started, right? And so I'm not saying spend hours and hours and hours building something, but maybe I don't know, 2 or 3 hours on a rainy weekend when you can't go anywhere. Build something real quick and go, right, okay, I'm getting how this fits together now, right? Because for a lot of us, SQL databases, like I said earlier on, early in my career, SQL was the way to go. And the only way that we learned that was we built a SQL database, right? And I feel like perhaps sometimes developers get a bit complacent with their technology. Oh, well, I'll use .NET and jQuery, or .NET and React and a SQL database, and that's the application done. I can move on. Well, like we've already discussed, right? You've said there in your particular problem domain, there's it doesn't fit that nicely with standard SQL tables, and graph databases just seems to fit a little better. Unless you or someone on your team had spent the time to look into graph databases, you'll have never have known that, right?
Yeah, it caught us by surprise a bit. I think we were late to the party. Graph databases had already been around for a couple of years when we discovered them. So we were kind of living under a rock. I will happily admit that. So we only got aware of the graph database, I think, in 2015 or 16. But to my defense, I should say that cloud providers offering a Gremlin API or a Graph API whatsoever have only been around not a lot longer. I think the Cosmos DB offering has been introduced in 2017. I think Neptune is around kind of like for the same time. And there's others, but the theory has been around, I think, like 2012 for the Tinkerpop project. I think Tinkerpop has, or 2009, I don't really know. But it's only gaining momentum, I think, with the availability of cloud database providers. Because sure, you might you might choose to set them up themselves and deploy those servers yourself. There's offerings for that as well, but I think the cloud providers being available is a really big factor in growth in that regard when it comes to graph databases and their acceptance.
Oh, absolutely. If I as a developer, right, I put my developer hat on, not my podcaster hat on. As a developer, if I've got to go and install loads of software on a server and set it all up and provide passwords and all that kind of stuff, just to be able to connect my web app to it for storing data, and it's going to take 2 or 3 hours. Or if I can go to Azure or AWS or Google Compute or Linode or whoever and push 3 buttons and boom, there it is. What am I going to choose? I'm going to choose the easy path. And of course, like you say, because I know of Cosmos DB, and I remember going to see so this is all I know about graph databases, right? I remember going to an MS Ignite, I think it was, a number of years ago, 2-3 years ago now, where they showed off, hey, we've got this view of a graph database that has every single character in the Marvel Comics universe in it, and we can just sort of move around it without having to do lots of long-running queries. And I could find this character appeared in this comic with this other character, and they appeared in this series and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, wow, that's awesome. That must be a huge, and they were saying it was a huge amount of data. And I'm like, brilliant. And that's it. That's all I know about them. That's where my experience ends. But but they were showing off, hey, you can do this in Cosmos, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure that I could do that with an on-prem database server that I have to set up myself. And so I agree completely that it's the cloud provided databases, because there is a limit to it, but technically it's unlimited compute, right? And unlimited space, as long as you're willing to pay. So, and I don't have to set it up. So let's do it that way.
Definitely. I didn't see that particular example. It sounds very, very interesting. Sounds pretty awesome. I should say that Gremlin on Cosmos DB is just one of the APIs they offer, because at the core, Cosmos DB is a document database. You can store arbitrary documents, JSON documents. They are not actually JSON, but formatted as JSON when you query them. And so at the core, it's a document database, and there's various APIs. There's a kind of stripped down SQL dialect to query your data in Cosmos DB. I think they got a MongoDB API. They got a Cassandra API, and eventually, at the end, everybody's going to be modeled as documents. Whatever you throw at it, whether it's through the MongoDB API or the Cassandra API or whatever, eventually they're going to model what you throw at it as documents, which is pretty awesome, right? So it follows the multi-model approach, and Gremlin is one of the APIs that you can use to query Cosmos DB. And this is in my book also pretty easy. Just your vertices and your edges in the end are just plain documents in Cosmos DB in the document store, and usually where you would have isolated documents sitting around in the store. Once you kind of view those documents as vertices and edges, and interpret the data on those vertices and edges as links to other vertices and edges. It kind of all makes sense and comes together. So I think this might be theoretical, but I think with a document database at the core, you can model pretty much any data model you like. They can do key value as well. They can do rows. This is really awesome. But it's not just a graph database, Cosmos DB, I should say.
Mm.
But I should look up that example with the Marvel characters.
You totally should. If I can find it, I'll put it in the show notes for anyone listening. But yeah, it was. It seemed like a really, because I'm not a big comic book fan, right? So I'm not
Me neither.
Yeah, right. And I've seen some of the movies. I get that it's a big universe, but like just thinking about like there's 50, 60 years of shared stories between all of these characters. And they're always crossing over and appearing in different. So, you said earlier when you have that thing of the ownership, right? Well, imagine a story that contains a number of characters, but that exists in perhaps, I don't know if that's the term that they use, but a universe, right? And when they reboot that universe to retell the same stories, but with a slightly different character, are those the same stories? Well, they're similar enough. It's the same character, but a different version of that character. So, like, just trying to map some of that in your mind, you start to realize, this wouldn't work with tables, right? Because how are you going to manage all of that? So, I totally see why they did that. Yeah, I do know that I've used the Cosmos DB API using, Entity Framework. And SQL and things like that. So I know that the Cosmos DB can do, you throw some data at it and it does some magic and stores it. And then you throw a query at it, it does some magic and you get your data back. It's brilliant, I have to say. Okay, so we've talked about, we talked a little bit about graph databases. We talked a little bit about Gremlin. Let's talk about Gremlinq, right? So top of my head, I'm thinking Gremlinq just from the name. Hopefully, you've picked a name that would do this, right? It uses Gremlin and link. Is that right? Or am I completely out? Missed the point whatsoever?
No, that's the point. That's kind of the intention behind that. If you're being pedantic, you could say this is not really link, because for link, which is language integrated query, you should be able to write this special syntax in C# where you go I don't know, from from X in whatever, from this in this, select this and that. This is not what Gremlinq provides, but the suffix link is mainly due to the fact that you can write the operators in a link fashion, where you could also write select and the brackets and dot where and dot select again and dot select many, because it enables you to write queries just that look like link queries, like you link to SQL queries or whatever. They look like it in a fluent fashion, but the link part is a bit of a stretch, but it works. It works, and this is what you do in the end, right? You have some queries. You get them in your language, which is C#. So it's kind of language integrated queries. So I hope Microsoft doesn't mind that I call it link in the end, Gremlinq. And it falls together pretty nicely. It comes together. There's Gremlin and there's Link, so it's pretty obvious, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. And to be fair, I think that makes sense to a lot of people. When they think link, they're thinking extension methods with lambdas embedded in them, aren't they? That's what, like you say, they're thinking collection.where x goes to x.id equals 7, right? That's what they think when they think link. They don't think from collection where id equals, right? They're not thinking, because like the link syntax is very SQL-like, isn't it? Like the actual I mean, it's terrible, right? We're talking on an audio podcast, and I'm speaking syntax. But when you have like, I have a collection of ints, and I do from int collection select x equals 3. That's link, but for a lot of people, it is collection dot where x equals. And no, I totally get that. I totally get why you've chosen that, because, like you say, it uses that fluent like syntax with the extension methods that take in the predicates and the functions and things, and B, it just rolls off the tongue really nicely.
Yeah, it does.
And naming things is hard, and I think you won. Excellent. So from the name of it, then I'm thinking Gremlinq allows me to connect to some Gremlin API and use link syntax to actually get my collections and filter them and sort them and select and project and things like that. Is that what's going on?
This is pretty much what's going on. So as with any query language, or any language that is a different language as your host language, be it SQL, you could also write Gremlin. You could also write raw Gremlin, right? There's a library that Gremlinq relies upon as well, Gremlin.net, which allows you to do just that. Write your raw Gremlin code. You could even write it fluently, but you would still have all these strings, right? You would still have to write dot has label and then a string for your vertex label. And but you could also write a raw Gremlin script and just execute that on the server. But in the end, it's just a string, right? And for Cosmos DB, you're still stuck with that. You can't do, at least when you're using Gremlin.net, you can't still do better for Cosmos DB than write a raw string script with raw Gremlin inside. So after all, it's just a string. You can't really, it doesn't refactor magically when you refactor other code, right? It doesn't change names when you hit F2 and change your class names and so on. So maintaining a string and coming up with a string and maintaining it, and composing strings, composing string queries is not something you would like to do. And this might be a bold statement, because there might be reasons to do that. There's definitely reasons to write raw SQL. If it's handcrafted and it's hand optimized, and it's kind of stable, it's definitely a good approach, especially if you got people who are really good at what they're doing in SQL and they really know their craft. This is perfectly fine. But for a rapid development approach, or when you're in development and things are changing rapidly, this might not be what you want to do. You might not, especially when you're new to Gremlin databases, you might not want to write all these strings and rewrite them. And then there's a missing bracket, but it doesn't show you. The compiler can't help you with that, right? You don't. At least I did not want to write raw Gremlin strings. So I should say, to the defense of Gremlin.net, which is the awesome library that is underneath Gremlinq, it does allow you to have a kind of fluent syntax. As I said, there's still the native elements of a graph databases, labels, property names, which are still raw strings. And what Gremlinq now does is, not only does it provide you with a fluent syntax to come up with a query, but it like a good object relational mapper, like entity framework and stuff. It allows you to reason about the graph in your language C#, using your POCOs, your domain objects, your plain old C objects, right? So and instead of writing something like capital V dot has label, let's say person as a string, you can go and put the person, which is now your POCO, your class, into square brackets and be strongly typed. This is the magic that Gremlinq does. So it allows you to reason about the objects that are on the graph server or in the graph database, but using your domain objects in C# to reason about them and to express queries. So then it'll allow you what you just said. It'll allow you to write .where x, right? Arrow x dot name equals Jamie, for example. It allows you to do that, formulate this, and you get complete compiler support here, right? If there's no property called name on your person vertex, it's not gonna compile. And what Gremlinq does is it translates your query, which is now a strongly typed checkable query in C#. It compiles it down to valid Gremlin, which is executable on the server. It can compile it to a Gremlin script, which is just the plain text string, but it can also compile it to bytecode, which is then handled again by gremlin.net, the underlying library, to execute it on the server, to query the server, to return the results to Gremlinq, which does then all the heavy lifting required to map it again to your domain objects. So let's say you're querying a range of persons in your database, and you get some raw data back by gremlin.net. You get some raw data back in GraphSon. This is the JSON dialect that comes back. Gremlinq will now do the mapping that's required to map to get the name property from the raw data, to get all the other properties from the raw data and map them to your POCOs and return those POCOs to you in the end. I think when I started out doing this, we already had a lot of code in Entity Framework already present. So we had all those POCOs around. And we figured, all right, we're not going to throw these away. We're not going to throw the logic away. We're not going to throw these entity classes away. What are we going to do? Is there something like Entity Framework for the graph world? There wasn't. So we figured we might as well just write it, right?
I love it. I love when necessity is the mother of all invention, right? Yeah. You're saying, hey, we've got this graph database. We don't want to use magic strings because although you can make a lot of money in magic strings because then you're the only person who can fix them when they break. Like you said, we've got this entire domain mapped out in C# code. How do we marry that up? How do we join that up to the graph database? Oh, well, there isn't one, so let's write our own. I absolutely love that. I love to hear stories like that where it's like, hey, we needed this thing and it didn't exist, but now it exists. It's brilliant.
It does. And I get some feedback sometimes on GitHub, and it seems that because I want to bring this topic forward, right? I want to get graph databases. I want to do what I can. I want to help getting accepted and considered more. So I like it when people say, thank you for the library. It's not about the thank you, but about I wouldn't have used a graph database had it not been for Gremlinq, which is kind of, you got to be a .NET developer to use Gremlinq, right? So this only covers a small, or maybe not so small, but just a percentage of all people using graph databases. So I'm not speaking for all the developers using graph database, and everybody else might just be fine with their tooling. But I like it when people say, I would not have considered, I'm a .NET developer, and I would not have considered using a graph database had it not been for Gremlinq. This is a nice thing to hear. Definitely.
Yeah, I can imagine that it is. One of these days, I'll make something that everybody uses. I'm sure I'll feel the same.
Yeah, that would put a big burden on me if kind of everybody would start using that. I would have to quit my job and rely completely on GitHub sponsors, I guess.
I think that's a potential downfall in the open source community at the moment. Nobody really. I mean, open source has been around for since the 60s technically, and nobody's really fully come up with a nice way to monetize it. You can pay for support or whatever, but because there's a story of the guys the folks who make Identity Server. Well, the next version of it is going to be non-free. So that's the only reason because they were saying the same thing. We don't get any money from doing this, and everybody uses it. How are we going to make the next version?
I think that puts. I didn't get that. I think it was Jimmy Bogart earlier today who posted a comment on GitHub. You might have seen that on Twitter. I didn't get the context from that. There was kind of a user. Yeah, I guess he expressed his dislike with something that went up. I don't know. And Jimmy Bogart kind of commented on that. That might have been related to that. So I didn't know that. So they're gonna go commercial. All right, didn't know that.
Yeah, it's I believe they're called Duende. What I'll do is for your benefit, David, I'll put it into the chat system that we use. So I'll put that there, and I'll put the link into the show notes. But yeah, they're hitting the same problem. They're like, hey, we make this is now our thing that we do, and everybody uses it, and we've got no support. So I'm gonna start charging people. So and that makes perfect sense to me, right? If you think about everyone who's used Identity Server for all of their authorization stuff, and they've used it all for free and never paid any money to help develop it, it makes perfect sense. And yeah, you'd end up in a situation similar if everyone in the .NET world started using GraphQL and then graph databases and went, right, we'll all use Gremlinq. That would be great, but also terrifying.
Yes, definitely. I'm not so sure. So I guess I'm not too familiar with Identity Server, but it's a kind of a standalone project, right? So that makes sense to me to have a standalone application go commercial and being paid. I don't see that for libraries actually. How are you going to go and charge for something that is a NuGet? Are we going to go back to I don't know, putting some licensing code in there and check the system clock and kind of stop working after your license runs up? I don't know how this is gonna work for libraries. So I don't know. Do you?
Like I say, open source is hard. Like figuring out how to fund open source is hard. I've heard of there's a license called the AGPL, I think it is.
Yeah.
Where you can say, hey, you can use it for free, but I want you to pay me, so much money for every production version or whatever, which makes sense, right? But like I say, funding open source is hard. But yes. I feel we've gone off the topic of Gremlinq a little bit.
It's definitely a hot topic. I don't think I could charge people to use it because people would just, I don't know, it's licensed. Gremlinq is licensed under MIT terms. So people would probably just fork it and leave it at that, probably, if there's nobody else to maintain it and develop it further. But I guess people would always use the free version that's around. I don't think I could, because I don't want to go for the hassle and I don't know, build any licensing system into it to make people stop using it. So it'll probably always be free to use. I wouldn't know how to. I don't know. I wouldn't know how to make it non-free to use, or I wouldn't know how to make it stop working if not being paid for, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, I can do some. I can offer consulting on that, which I have done a couple of times in the past. So these are services that I can definitely offer for some amount of money.
And I think that's the true the support and consulting. I think is the actual way to, in my opinion, the actual way to make money as an open source creator. It's maybe not the best way to support an open source creator, but I think one of the ways that is the most accepted, right? Because I love using open source software, right? We've gone on a bit of a tangent towards open source software, but I love using open source software because if there's something that I want to change, I can just literally, git clone, change it, build it, and away we go. But I sometimes dislike using open source software because I know that someone somewhere is sitting in their house at 4 o'clock in the morning trying to figure out why it isn't working. And then they get up at 8 o'clock or whatever and go to work, right? And then they come home and they work through the evening on this passion project, which is great. But also it means that, this person is not sleeping, right? And that's not fair. We can't do that to people. And so, that I often wonder about how I can give back. And maybe submitting a patch is the way to give back, or maybe just shouting up again, hey, that project is amazing. Thanks for making it. I'm having a lot of fun. It's for much, much smarter people than I to figure out. I am not a smart person. We'll let the smart people figure this out.
Yeah, contributing back is definitely a way to go. Whenever I contribute to some other project, I usually make sure that I put in some effort. So this is my way of giving back, not just, even if it's a bug report, I try to make it as concise as possible, because I consider this a contribution as well, right? If you do the research on your part and really examine the bug or whatever it is, or the unexpected behavior, doing proper research is already contributing, I assume. So, and I specifically asked this from people who raise issues on my project to give me something I can run easily, quickly, so that I can see there has some effort being taken on the other side, and to save my time, right, a bit. But it's an interesting, it's definitely an interesting thing to see how people interact on GitHub. There's people who put more work into an issue. There's people who put less work into an issue. Yeah, definitely. But the issue about being paid or getting paid. I thought about, this is something that came to my mind at some point. Maybe we should offer things to be fixed of features as a Kickstarter project, like micro Kickstarter, where you don't have those the view on Kickstarter projects, which are big and require millions of funds to be collected. But you could go, I implement this feature for, let's say, $2,000. And everybody can just throw money at it. Once you reach the goal, you go ahead and implement it. That would be some interesting thing to, I don't know.
Yeah, that makes sense, because then that's covering that developer or that designer or whoever. It's covering their time, right? That makes perfect sense to me.
Because people are asking for documentation, and you mentioned documentation early on, and you you assume that there is extensive documentation on Gremlinq. Spoiler alert: there isn't. This is one of the questions I get all the time. Like, are you planning to provide some documentation? And sure, I am, kind of, but I would like to be able to go ahead and say, yeah, look, this is my Kickstarter campaign. I'm going to write some extensive documentation during my free time, during the night shifts. I'm not going to sleep at all for, 6 weeks for X amount of money, right? Because documentation is, at least for me, the not so fun part about doing this. And as a non-native speaker, coming up with stuff that look from like text that is kind of, I'm struggling right now.
Sure, yeah. trying to find
text that is rather formal and matches more documentary style is rather hard for me. I can banter back and forth, and I'm struggling all the time. But writing documentation that doesn't look really bad is hard for me. So this is the not so fun part about that. And sure, people could sponsor me or fund me to write more documentation, which is actually don't, because if you would fund me, I would have to write documentation. I would rather give it to somebody else. But
I think you're right. I think you've come up with a great idea for the future of open source, because if let's say some new feature, right, and you put up a poll and 400 people say yes, we like this feature, and you said to them, I'll build the feature if every single person sends me $5, because that will cover the time that it will take for me to build that feature. It will cover the time that I would have to take out of work or out of life to build that feature. I think that, I feel like that would make more sense.
Definitely. Yeah. I think there is a platform for that. There is something like Bounty and GitHub. Let me just look it up.
Oh, right. Yeah. So you can say, hey, yeah, I like that. And it makes sense, because I think that's what the Duende folks are doing, because it's like, hey, I think they said something like they'd only received $1,000 or $10,000 in direct financial support in the 10 years that they've been doing it, or something like that. And that, to me, personal opinion, that's kind of criminal, right? With companies making billions of dollars, essentially using this free software, I think it's unfair of them to have not contributed back in some way. But anyway, we've digressed way too much. Let's say I want to get using a graph database, and I want to use Gremlinq. Is there the equivalent of a Hello World application that you can think of off the top of your head that would make use of a graph database? Or is it just, hey, just get some entities, hang them together, throw them into a graph database, and use Gremlinq to get your head around it?
Yeah, the Hello World equivalent would, I don't know, if you're starting off with an empty database, you'd probably just add some vertices into the database to begin with. And your easiest Hello World application would be just, I don't know, writing @v, throwing some pokers at it, right? Your person vertex or whatever. Fill up the person object with some properties like name and date of birth and so on. And in the end, you would just write to array async, or after at the bare minimum first async, just like link, right? It's just like async link, and execute it and get something back. So this would be there is a samples project on GitHub, which is just the main repo with the postfix .samples, and there's some code to start with. There's a console application and an ASP application that you can run right off your IDE. just enter some credentials in the app settings.json. Just enter where your graph data, where your Cosmos DB is, or your Gremlin server, or whatever, and a password, the auth key, and you're set to go. So what the samples project does is it'll create some person vertices in the database, put some connection between them, like the knows edge, right? Like Jamie knows Daniel. And there's some pets around. There's cats and dogs. This is just to show off the inheritance support in Gremlinq, because they inherit from a common animal vertex. So you can query, or is it pet? I don't know. So you can query pet, and you get all the cats and all the dogs. This is a bit to show off the inheritance support. This would be a good starting point. There is not really a hello world in this domain, I guess.
Okay. I mean, as long as you can show that there are relationships between entities, you can map it in a graph database, right? As long as you, with those relationships being those vertices, you can map anything, right? So you could say, I have a bookcase and I have 12 books. 3 of them are by this author, 2 of them are by that author. Maybe in those 3 books that have the common author, there are 15 common characters, 2 common situations, and they're all in the same genre of story, right? You could probably map that, I guess.
Definitely. And as I said earlier, I think already when you model your traditional SQL database, most of the, or I would argue a lot of the time, you got a graph in mind. So the ultimate test that I would ask everybody to do is, when modeling your domain somehow and considering a graph database or considering a traditional SQL database or whatever, explain your domain to somebody without any prior knowledge, to your non-technical friends or whoever, and take a piece of paper and a pen and try to explain it to them. And you might at some point start drawing circles and putting names into those circles and connecting those circles by edges, unknowingly, maybe unwillingly. But if I don't know, I have discovered this quite a lot, that if you're going to explain something to somebody, you draw edges a lot of the times, right? Mm-hmm. And if you draw enough edges and enough circles, enough arrows and enough circles, then it's a good indicator that you might have a graph here, as a general test, as a general indicator.
Sure. So take whatever context you're working in, draw it as a diagram, and instead of using, say, squares to represent an entity, do it as a circle.
Yeah.
And draw the lines between them, end up with some kind of spiderish graph of all of these nodes and circles. Give everything names, and hey, guess what? You've just graphified. Is that even a word? You've just turned your model, your domain, into a graph. And go make it a graph. I like it.
Of course, you would have to think about your queries, what you want to know from the graph, because if all your queries are kind of trivial, you don't really need a powerful graph traversal language. But if you want to know, I don't know, just the example you came up with a minute ago about the books and the authors, like there's, I don't know, given a book, what other books has this author written? This is already a trivial question, but it's really nicely expressed in a graph language, right? In a graph traversal language. I wouldn't have to make any joins between tables. I wouldn't really know how to make any. I wouldn't really even know anymore how to write SQL. I wouldn't know what's required to make this. Like we have a book table and an author table, and you're given a book, and now you're going to join this with the author and join it back with the books. This is already 2 joins, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't know how to do this anymore. I will freely admit that. And in a graph query language, it's easy. You just traverse from the book to the author by whatever edge connects them. I don't know. You might call the edge has written, because I like to I like to give vertices a label that is a noun, and I like to give edges a label that is a verb. So you can actually tell stories. Author has written book. So you would just go back this has written edge and then traverse back all the has written edges out and get all the books. And this is pretty easily done in a graph query language. But this is still a very easy use case. There is harder problems than that.
Sure. I guess I feel like it was an unfair question, really. Give me the killer app for graph databases. Well, there isn't one. It's like we said earlier, it's whatever your domain fits into, right? If your domain fits into a graph database, go give it a try with a graph database. If your domain fits into a SQL database with tables and joins and foreign keys, then go do it that way. I'm a very, very big proponent of whatever fits. Do it the way that, use the technology that fits. But with that being said, Daniel, just real quick, with that being said then, where can folks go to find out more about Gremlinq and to find out more about yourself? Because you said earlier on, everything's on GitHub. Is that the way that you let people know about new releases and things like that? Is it GitHub? Is it Twitter? What's the way?
Sure, you can follow me on Twitter. It's at Daniel C. Weber. This is at Daniel C. Weber. Follow me on GitHub. Doesn't really matter. You can follow me on GitHub, but I have never quite figured out what this is good for. On GitHub, just Google xram Gremlinq. This is exram.gremlinq. The address is github.com/xram/xram.gremlinq. This is the go-to page, and there is this prefixed version with the samples. At the end, this is the sample, but there's also a link on the main page. There is unfortunately no dedicated website for Gremlinq yet, and I wouldn't really know whether it makes a lot of sense. Maybe for documentation, if there is ever any to come up. Yeah, there will be documentation in the end, but I don't know. There's those samples, and I guess people can go from there, right? Just clone the repo and have a look. Press the dot button on your keyboard. Make the IDE come up with all the suggestions. Have a look at the signatures. Have a look of what's going inside those methods. Right. See how it fits together. Hover over the methods to see what it's returning, what the signature is, and you can go from there. But I agree, of course, that proper documentation is just a professional way to go.
Sure.
In the end, but we're getting there.
I mean, maybe people can submit professional documentation as a pull request.
Definitely, they can. Definitely, I would like everybody to figure out Gremlinq as thoroughly as possible, and to be able to come up with documentation. But just like it is, open source. It's sometimes a bit thankless profession.
It is, unfortunately, sometimes. Okay, what I'll do is I'll put all of those links into the show notes. So if you are listening along and want to check it out, which I suggest you do anyway, press through to the show notes. There'll be a section just with links on there. Definitely go check that out. Or indeed, go find Daniel on Twitter, and I'm sure you got a link on your Twitter. If not, then they can find it from there. That's wonderful. Excellent. All that really remains to say, Daniel, is thank you ever so much for being on the show. I now feel like I've learnt so a huge amount about graph databases. And I think what I'm going to do is this weekend, I'm going to take an application of mine, draw it out on paper, basically hand draw an entity relational diagram just to show how everything's linked together and see if I can convert it into a graph database. Why not, right? Put it in a graph database and see what happens.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me on the show. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
No worries. Thank you ever so much. That was my interview with David Weber about Gremlinq. Be sure to check out the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff that we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show, and there will be a link directly to them in your podcatcher. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. Head over to .netcore.show/subscribe for ways to do that, and to come back next time for more .NET Core goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks. The .NET Core Podcast is a production of RJJ Software Limited.